Retired Admiral John Gower is a senior advisor on strategic weapons at the Council on Strategic Risks, and he is a former Assistant Chief of Defence Staff, Nuclear, Chemical, Biological in the UK Ministry of Defence, and he had the MOD lead for UK nuclear weapons between 2008 and 2014. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Dan. It's good to talk to you again.
You've just written a pretty sobering piece for the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, essentially saying, and you can steer me correctly if I'm taking it out of context somehow, but it seems to me that you're saying threats to respond to Russia's idea of using a tactical nuclear weapon with a conventional response, and that somehow those threats would deter Russia, are a fantasy.
Yes, I mean, that's the second conclusion of my paper, that the title sort of links to the first conclusion, and that is that the US response in September and October to an increased ramping up of the nuclear rhetoric, which has always been a subtext from before Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine in February. It's always been a subtext and a back threat from the Kremlin that initially the Americans chose, quite rightly in my view, and the rest of the West, not to respond specifically to the nuclear threats because of a desire not to nuclearize what was clearly at that stage, excuse me, I'm coming out of COVID, so I may cough a bit, and not to nuclearize what was essentially and still remains a bloody conventional conflict. But that the response by both Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, and President Biden a day or so later to this increased rhetoric was not to follow what has been established doctrine for some time on both sides of the superpower divide, that there was in some idea this limited nuclear exchange space that existed between the conventional war and all-out nuclear Armageddon strategic exchange. You would think, if you followed that strategy that's been present in all of the nuclear posture reviews in recent years, that the response, if they chose to respond rhetorically in a nuclear sense, would be, well, you know, we can match you, we will ensure that you will receive an equal level of pain should you choose to use nuclear weapons. That's what you might have expected. But in fact, both leaders chose extremely stronger language. They talked about a catastrophic response, if you look at Jake Sullivan's response, and if you look at the words of President Biden, he used the word Armageddon. Now, neither catastrophic response nor Armageddon are restrained, parallel, limited exchange.
Let's be accurate about the quote, as you did in your article. On September the 25th, Jake Sullivan stated, "We have communicated directly, privately, and at the very high levels to the Kremlin that any use of nuclear weapons will be met with a catastrophic consequence for Russia, and that the US and our allies will respond decisively. And we have been clear and specific about what that will entail." And then on October the 6th, at a fundraiser in New York, President Biden said, "We have not faced the prospect of Armageddon since Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis." So
yes.
The rhetoric that you referred to very accurately was, in your opinion, was escalatory, not the other way around.
No, I don't believe it didn't serve as a deterrent. No, I don't believe it to be escalatory at all. I believe it to be exactly the right response. What is dangerously escalatory, because it implies you have this, in inverted commas, safe space where the two superpowers could exchange limited scale of nuclear weapons in a third country, one would assume the battlefield of Ukraine, is destabilizing and threshold reducing. And that's something, as you well know, that I and others, including Andrew Webber from CSR, have been pushing for a long time, is that these so-called tactical, low-yield, short-range weapons are, because they are below the level of a major nuclear exchange, are easier in the mindset of those who are minded to do so, easier to use. Now, in the past, as I have said, the US has maintained within its triad a level of these weapons, both air-launched and initially some time ago sea launched, and the Trump administration's NPR indicated a desire to replace the submarine-launched cruise missile, which had been retired, firstly by the Clinton administration, and then finally abandoned by, they've been retired into storage by the Clinton administration, then finally abandoned by the Obama administration. These are weapons designed solely to be used at this theoretically low, limited exchange level. And what I'm saying is that to have responded in that doctrinal sense that will match you, giving an idea that the two superpowers could somehow control this limited nuclear exchange, which I believe also to be a fallacy, actually to say, no, what you would receive if you took this conflict from its conventional level to the nuclear level, is that's not just a minor escalation, that's a major paradigm shift, and you would receive a catastrophic or Armageddon level response. And what that will have done, I am absolutely certain, is to make it clear in the Kremlin that his personal survival would be placed in balance if he made this ridiculously stupid decision to do that.
Okay,
now
you're saying up the ante.
I'm saying that ante has never been lowered, but it has been muddied and declarified. It has been made more contentious by having this mixed message that, on the one hand, nuclear weapons are so bad that you could never win such a war and should never be fought, as said by Reagan, Gorbachev, and reiterated actually just before, in realistic terms, by Biden and Putin. That on the one hand, this is an absolutely unthinkable thing, and yet while maintaining these capabilities that exist solely to fight nuclear war at a limited level. And this belief that you can do that and you can cap that escalation so that you don't go up into the strategic response. And
okay, but what got us here, if I think about this correctly, is that the US and NATO has said they are not coming into direct conflict with Russia in Ukraine because it is not a NATO country. They will support them. They will train them. They will supply arms to them so that they can be a sovereign nation. But they won't come into. They will not protect them with any kind of umbrella, including a nuclear umbrella. So it would have been irresponsible, surely, for President Biden or anyone in his administration to threaten Russia that if they used a nuclear weapon, a tactical nuclear weapon, which is just a, for people that don't understand the differences in nuclear weapons, one is a ballistic missile that goes a very long distance, and a tactical weapon can be a smaller yield weapon, which goes a shorter distance and can be launched into a battlefield like Ukraine, potentially. That if they had raised the specter of a nuclear threat against Russia, even though Russia was threatening first a possible tactical nuclear use in Ukraine, everybody would have said that was highly irresponsible by the US administration.
Well, what had clearly changed between the February veiled threats by President Putin and Foreign Minister Lavrov, that the response that the Russians would wreak on a NATO that interfered in their peacekeeping action. I forget the exact oxymoron that the Russians used to
special operation,
illegal evasion of a sovereign nation. That they alluded to the level of destruction that could only be interpreted or could not be discounted to include nuclear weapons.
Yes, and I agree. And just to support you on that, President Putin himself has said that, we're not bluffing, quote unquote. And he said, they'll use everything at their disposal.
Yeah, it is clear that by September, the messaging that was coming out of Russia and the intelligence assessment, to which I'm not privy, but the intelligence assessment was that this was no longer a generic bluff-related threat, that there were specific indicators that Russia had moved to consider this much more realistically. Now, clearly, if you are detonating nuclear weapons in a nation contiguous to NATO, it is extremely likely that the effects of those weapons will come into NATO nations, even setting aside the paradigm shift of detonating the first nuclear weapon in anger since 9th of August 1945. I will have to slightly correct you on the characterization of tactical weapons. First, the first use of them is by no means tactical. And secondly, as the Trump NPR made it clear that they were seeking a so-called low-yield warhead for Trident, that the delivery vehicle is not the key when those who advocate these weapons are considering them. So short-range to medium-range ballistic missiles can be the deliverers, or indeed in Trident sense, should it ever come through this dangerous nature of a low-yield Trident. The delivery system is not necessarily simply a short range, although it does include those short and medium range. But I think what was clearly had changed.
Sorry, since you waded into that water, will you make it clear for people who are not nuclear weapons experts, then how would you define a tactical weapon as opposed to?
Well, I mean, in my judgment, there's no such thing as a tactical weapon. There was, during the period that weapons were endemic across all armed forces, and I went to see, when I joined the Navy in the 80s, every ship of frigate size and above had nuclear weapons on board. Military units in the German standoff plane on the between the Warsaw Pact and NATO, or whether you're an artillery unit, a tank unit, an aircraft unit, or indeed infantry units in the early part of the Cold War, all had nuclear weapons. And it was considered absolutely impossible to avoid the employment of nuclear weapons in a conflict with the Warsaw Pact. And therefore, you could argue in that scenario that there were weapons that were tactical in nature, but that fortunately that did not transpire, and the majority of those weapons have left the arsenals of both nations, and particularly the NATO nations. None of the NATO countries now have weapons that could be described directly as tactical, although there are gravity bombs in the dual-capable aircraft manned by certain NATO nations. There are American weapons that are allocated to those nations, and the UK has no weapons below the strategic level.
All right, thank you for that. Now, can continue on with your first point before I derailed you there.
So my point is that in October or late September, clearly the intelligence had changed, that this was gone from a generic threat to something far more specific and proximate, and that because the nature of nuclear weapons is not as able to be constrained to borders as conventional weapons, although we have seen an overspill in November, on the 15th of November, into Poland, causing the unfortunate death of 2 people. Largely, the conventional war has been contained to the countries of Ukraine and Russia, the combatants. Clearly, the US felt that they could no longer ignore this undercurrent of threat, and they chose to make it extremely clear that whatever nuclear weapon the Russians were considering would result in a devastating response, a catastrophic Armageddon response. It does not matter which of those words you choose. And I think, firstly, we haven't seen any further rhetoric from Russia since then, in the months that follow, that could be construed as being escalatory in the nuclear sense. So from that respect, you could argue quite easily that that response was the right one. I think it is the right one anyway, because this mythological controlled escalation at low levels of nuclear weapon use has yet to be tested, and I don't think it should be.
But they were not implying in that a nuclear response. They were implying in that a conventional response.
No, they were not.
To a nuke. I believe that they were, because a lot of the background briefings in Washington but the MOD here in the UK would be a conventional response, and then you had General Petraeus, who was the former CENTCOM commander, and then later on the head of the CIA, coming out and talking about a conventional response.
You did, but I don't believe that is what is before in the minds of the president and the National Security Advisor. You cannot derive Armageddon from conventional responses, and that word was not chosen at random. The deliberations on nuclear rhetoric are not words snatched from Twitter in any sensible presidency. There was an acceptance that this transition in the 21st century to a nuclearization of the conflict could not be countenanced. Now, subsequent to those statements, there has been a significant. So Sullivan made his statement in late September. General Petraeus suggested an interview on the 2nd of October, as you rightly say, that a response could be conventional. And then 4 days later, President Biden doubled down with Armageddon words. Now, the reason I suspect he did so was this bubbling up of a concept of a conventional response, which I could not conceive of a more of a rhetoric more calculated to bolster the advice President Putin is giving, that Russia could not only survive such an escalation into nuclear, but they may paralyze the West into a response level which was not even approaching that of nuclear weapons.
Okay, can I jump in again? You wrote,
Certainly.
if there were no nuclear response, the whole tapestry of nuclear deterrence across the world could unravel dangerously. This dilemma, how to respond to a nuclear use, has dogged every secret war game since the turning of the millennium. So you clearly believe that there would have to be a nuclear response, and then we can talk about whether that would be a limited nuclear response, of which I know you don't believe there's such a thing.
Well, let me be very clear about this, that my experience and my rhetoric and my judgment is all about the deterrence of the first nuclear use. Therefore, in deterring that, your deterrence messaging, rhetoric, and posture needs to be unequivocal that moving from the conventional domain to the nuclear domain is a significant paradigm shift move. And the problem with the limited exchange concept is that you have moved from this being paradigm to being an escalation of relatively controllable in your mindset. As I said to politicians that I briefed when I was in the Ministry of Defense and responsible for the military input into the nuclear policy of the United Kingdom, I did not focus on what the response actually would be. Firstly, because it's largely it's an angels on the head of the pin, because no one's been in that position before, and the politicians will make the decision. And it may be they choose to do nothing. If you'll recall that the UK has a last resort letter concept, where the SSBNs have a letter written by the incumbent Prime Minister, although I suspect Prime Minister Truss's letter never got to all of the SSBNs in the time that she was briefly Prime Minister, because one of them was probably on patrol before she became Prime Minister and was still on patrol when she resigned. But most Prime Ministers managed to get a letter onto each of the SSBNs, and in that it has to forecast what response the SSBN CO would do in the event that the CO judged that the UK had been destroyed, to the point that there was no decision-making capability left in London. And so there is always a range of responses available to the Prime Minister.
And what is that? Would you share what that is?
No, because I was never privy to it. My role in that was simply to make sure that the envelope got to the SSBN and that it existed, and that the criteria that the CO had to go through before he or she was empowered to open that envelope was long and considerate. But the only person who knew what was in that envelope was the sitting Prime Minister. The envelopes that come back are shredded without opening, and they're sealed by the Prime Minister before they go out. But my point in raising that is that there is always a range of responses to the Prime Minister, or President. But that if you were to say, as some Prime Ministers have said since they left, oh, I would never have responded, then that is not helpful to deterrence. So you do not say that. You do not say what your response is. That is where the ambiguity comes in. But you do need to make it clear that the response could include a devastating and catastrophic response, because that is what deters.
Right. Okay, so when you're talking about this ambiguity, you write that clear blue water needs to be reestablished and maintained between conventional conflict and any nuclear weapon attack. You're saying clear blue water in the sense that it's quite muddy water, and in one side or the other, understanding what the other might do.
Well, I think it is only muddy when you're considering this at the level, and I argue that you shouldn't be considering nuclear weapons with the same mindset that you consider warfare. So you consider war, when you look at war, whether you're a politician or a military officer, you look at war at a series of risk balances. Do I engage in this attack, or do I do this invasion? What is my chance of winning? What is my troop loss? What's the consequences of what I do? And you supposedly layer on top of that the law of armed conflict. I won't target civilians. I won't target nuclear power stations. I'm not allowed to do all of these things in my pursuit of this war. But essentially, war is a series of calculated risk balances. Can I surprise? Can I win? Does the cost outweigh, or does the gain outweigh the cost? Nuclear weapons should never be part of that logic, because that in there lies the danger of their use, because applying them in that logic means you're starting to look at them as merely incremental capabilities in that battle space. And so the water is only muddied when you have these capabilities and mindsets that consider nuclear weapons as just the next layer of the spectrum of conflict. And so what I am saying is you need to take them to the point that the UK has them today. And that is that nuclear weapons are not a warfighting tool. They are not a weapon of war. In my understanding and my judgment, there's no such thing as a nuclear war, because war implies a limited risk with gain and survival at the end of it. And as soon as you bring nuclear weapons into it, survival of the species, given all the discussions about nuclear winter and everything like that, comes in. This is way beyond the sort of things that you should be thinking about when you're looking at conflict between nations. So we need to get rid of that mud. And we get rid of that mud by saying that if you consider these weapons, you will receive a disproportionately bad response. So don't even consider them. Don't get into this game.
Ukraine included, and the Russians should understand that.
Absolutely, because NATO, in the face of in the mouthpiece of its primary nuclear power, and it is inconceivable to my mind that Jens Stoltenberg was not in some way aware of what the US was going to say before the National Security Advisor or the President said it, or at least there were discussions afterwards about what they meant. NATO as a body has made it clear to Russia that nuclearization, use of nuclear weapons, would stop this being a war in Ukraine. This would be something far more significant and serious. And the problem with saying, as General Petraeus said before clarification perhaps was offered by the president, the problem with saying that a conventional response is what is needed is that you cannot, the whole point about having nuclear deterrence is you cannot conceive of a conventional response that delivers the psychological and realistic concentration of force and shock that a nuclear weapon detonation generates. And so when you're looking at this gain-loss equation, because that's what essentially you're trying to do, and particularly if you say in advance that that is what your response is doing, you're essentially saying to the person considering nuclear weapons, we're not going to come back to you with nuclear weapons. We're going to do some horrific things, but it's not going to be a nuclear weapon. And that, to me, the sort of person like President Putin who might think about the use of a nuclear weapon is not going to be dissuaded. In fact, he's going to be enabled by it. And if you choose to make your conventional response as close to devastating as you can, then you have to do it at such a scale that a leader who has already used a nuclear weapon is not going to be dissuaded from a second use, particularly as your response was non-nuclear. At what point in that exchange does your response have to become nuclear? And at what point in that, and have you then accelerated the escalation such that it just blows out of control. My judgment is it blows out of control.
Do you really believe that there would be a nuclear response by the West to a use of a nuclear weapon on a non-NATO actor such as Ukraine?
I believe that it is a very strong possibility. One could say perhaps almost a probability. I think it is extremely challenging to try and apply the mindset and the discussion before a nuclear weapon has gone off. We've never been in this situation, to the situation where a nuclear weapon has gone off, and those news outlets and internet capabilities that are not fried by the electromagnetic pulse from that weapon will be, I mean, if you think current news response is 24/7 and focused and strident, my belief is wait and see, because the calls for a nuclear response will be strong, you know, from every corner of the you know, we've had calls for responses, more direct responses at the conventional level. Can you imagine what they would be like after a nuclear weapon had gone off? But I reiterate, my point is that I'm not focused on what the response is. I'm focused on messaging that the response would be significant for the continued ability of Vladimir Putin to rule Russia. That is what is at the core of his mindset throughout all of this. It's about maintaining power and control and re-establishing Russia in his mind, perhaps as Soviet Union .2. And I think those that say that a devastating response is not credible, I say to them, it doesn't matter. That what is the point that matters is not that the adversary needs to be sure that you would do that, but that he must be sure that you would not before he launches his attack. And the problem with articulating a conventional response is it bolsters the sure that you would not. He already believes the West to be weak, divided, and unable to consider the strength of response to him. Already he considers that. And if you articulate your response in conventional terms, you are bolstering that part of his advice team that are saying the West would crumble were you to do this.
How do you read the fact that Russia failed to show up at the START nuclear verification reduction talks this month? That they were simply a no-show, and then there were statements inside of Russia, I believe, from the foreign ministry that said they're not going to sit with the US while the US continues to supply arms to Ukraine. They're not going to discuss nuclear reduction or controls. That's not a good situation.
It's not a good situation, and it is absolutely clear, and it was clear before the invasion of Ukraine, that the trust deficit and the total loss of arms control and verification, the only thing that survives the last 5 years is the final thread of the New START treaty, which deals only with strategic weapons. Everything else, conventional confidence building measures, conventional arms control in Europe, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, the ABM Treaty, over the last 2 decades, all of those have gone. And there is zero trust between both sides of the domain. And you go back to a little bit further back to the review conference of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was delayed by the COVID pandemic. And the NPT review conference produced a final document in draft, which was not produced, if you like, officially, because Russia refused, and they refused to sign it because it spoke not under the nuclear weapons section, but under the peaceful uses pillar. It spoke negatively about the Russian shelling and attacks on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in the disputed area of Ukraine where the battle has been going on. But I would say that what was significant is that every other country believed that to be a good final document. So essentially, going forward, the international community should take that as the final document. And for the first time ever, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty included a paragraph in there about nuclear risk reduction. It's never done so before because the non-nuclear weapon states have said We object in principle to countries owning nuclear weapons. So we will not discuss about reducing the risk. We will only talk about Article 6 and the removal of nuclear weapons. But the trust deficit, the danger is such that even these countries, while retaining their vehement opposition to nuclear weapons per se, were content for the first time ever in the 50+ years of the treaty to sign up to nuclear risk reduction. Largely, that surrounds rhetoric and capabilities, and particularly weapons that could be deemed to be tactical, the sort of weapons that no doubt Putin had in mind when he made his comments and his veiled threats. And so the situation has got to such a parlous state in terms of trust that it is not good enough now simply to wait for this trust to regain itself, because the threat is more immediate than that. And so nuclear weapon states on the West must start to look at their postures and their capabilities that do not diminish the ability to deter at the strategic level, as was the case in September and October, but start to remove those weapons that invite this kind of low-level exchange that has now been shown to be a rhetorical fallacy.
And that was my last question to you. Why have we not done that? Because all of the nuclear weapons discussions have been about these warheads mounted on ballistic missiles that can, hit the United States or vice versa, hit Russia. And they have not dealt with what are thousands of what you call less than strategic weapons and other people call tactical weapons. They never dealt with those. And they seem to be now the more immediate threat.
No, they absolutely are. I mean, it was right and proper when there were 66,000 nuclear warheads between the superpowers at the height of the Cold War, of the madness of the totality of weapons everywhere, and that the concept was that people were looking and were worried about a strategic nuclear exchange. This is where a missile shield, this is where Star Wars came from, this is where the Moscow ABM system came from. It was about protecting against this devastating first strike. It was right and proper that the SALT and then the START talks limited and then reduced the number of strategic nuclear weapons. These are down to a very low level relatively, 1,500 warheads per side. It's a large amount. It's many more than you need. The UK has 40 at sea at any one stage and believes that is sufficient to act as a deterrent. So there is still a way to go. But the fact is that these weapons are no longer the most significant risk present in the nuclear domain, the most significant risk, as Ukraine is showing, because this is where the first direct threats of nuclear weapon employment have been made since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And they have shown that it is the weapons at the less than strategic level, whether you ascribe them a tactical moniker or not, it does not matter. What they are ascribed in the mentality both of Russia and the US and others is that there is this kind of middle ground between conventional war and strategic exchange, where there is, in inverted commas, a safe space where you could have a nuclear exchange but not escalate into the strategic level.
And that's why people like John Gower say eliminate those weapons. Eliminate
Absolutely.
the temptation to use them, or the idea that you could ever use them without leading us into a much higher escalation of a nuclear exchange.
I cannot prove that escalation is not controllable, but neither can those who say it is controllable prove it. And I would rather not test it by a limited exchange of nuclear weapons than escalating. These weapons produce nothing in terms of the value of nuclear deterrence. If they did, Jake Sullivan and President Biden would have alluded to them in their response, that they should be removed now from the arsenal. They should be removed multilaterally, but because they give nothing in terms of deterrence, because they are not needed to deter at this low level, because they were not referenced by the responses by the National Security Advisor and the President, there is no strategic national security loss in removing them from your arsenal. And by removing them from your arsenal, there is nothing against which Russia or any other country could see them against. They know then that the response will be strategic, so why maintain them?
And yet you may be
it is
swimming against the tide here when you look at North Korea, when you look at Pakistan, when you look at China. These weapons are probably seen to are being seen by them to possibly be deployable.
Well, you could ask the question, why do they see them as deployable? Because the longest established nuclear weapon states continue to deploy them and continue to make what they see to be rational reasons for them. It is not credible for the extant nuclear weapon states to castigate the newer nuclear weapon states for simply following their lead in the weapons that they choose to do so. So you could say we need to have these because people following us might get them, but to me that's crazy. What you could say is we don't need these, let's get rid of them, and then see what the response is. You still have 1,500 nuclear warheads at the strategic level, which you can use, as has been shown, to dissuade lower level use, lower level employment. It's not credible to say I need to keep my assault rifle because the other guy might have an assault rifle.
Any other time, John, I'd say the whole conversation was crazy because we are not anywhere near the precipice of somebody discussing a nuclear exchange. But I think in the last 9 months, unfortunately, the conversations about nuclear weapons and possible deployment have become all too real. So thank you so much for the article that you wrote and explaining that, taking a long time to kind of walk through it. It's complicated, but it's vitally important. And so John Gower, Rear Admiral, Senior Advisor on Strategic Weapons for the Council on Strategic Risks. Thank you so much, John.
It's my pleasure. These matters do not lend themselves to sound bites.